Welcome to the Orthogonal Bet, where we explore the weird and wonderful ideas that shape our world. It's a cabinet of curiosities for the ears and the mind. I'm your host, Samuel Arbesman, complexity scientist, author, and scientist in residence at Lux Capital. In this episode, I had the pleasure to speak with Nick Foster. Nick is a designer and futurist who has worked with numerous large companies imagining various futures, from Nokia and Dyson to Google. He is the author of the new book, Could, Should, Might, Don't, about the different ways that we do and can think about the future. Nick and I had a chance to speak about how he ended up working in the space of futures thinking and the nature of futures design work in companies. We discussed his taxonomy of different kinds of futures design, the need for thinking about the future and how to get better at it, mistakes we make when thinking about the future, and the limits of forecasting. We even discussed his take on science fiction, as well as his own futures approach that he calls the, quote, future mundane, which involves the future as a lived-in world. This conversation was mind-expanding and a lot of fun, and I had a great time speaking with Nick. Let's jump in. Nick, thanks so much for being here and being able to chat on the Orthogonal Bet. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, this is exciting. Your new book is fantastic. Lots of great things in there. I think maybe just the best place to start would just be to give listeners just a sense of your path to the world of futures and like thinking about the future, I guess futures plural as well. How did you get into this? How did you fall into this world? How did you direct yourself there?
How long have you got? Yeah, to be from the get-go, I think people should understand that I'm a designer. I'm a designer that's worked in sort of future-oriented technologies for large organizations, particularly for about the last 20 years. I grew up in the Midlands in the UK, sort of a damp post-industrial engineering town. My father was a railway engineer and his father was a railway engineer. I studied industrial design in London and then studied at the Royal College of Art. I was an early engineer at Dyson back in the 90s, developing new products for them. And then, worked in agencies for a bit in the UK, worked for Sony, doing a lot of work on future objects, products, technologies between Tokyo and London, and then moved to Nokia. Do you remember them? Where I worked in the advanced design team, which brought me over to Silicon Valley, and I did some work over here with them, spent some time at Google, then I was made head of design at Google X, where I was leading a team, sort of a multidisciplinary team, for about 7.5, 8 years nearly, and I left there in 2023. I've always been interested in the future, and it's a very complicated term in itself, but it's just that sort of irresistible curiosity. I don't come from a sort of manifesto mindset where I'm trying to bring about a certain thing in the world. I'm just really curious about what it might be like to be 70 in this place and sort of try to bring that to life as best I can. And design's been an amazing channel to explore that curiosity.
I have a lot of questions related to that. But I guess one is just when you are embedded in companies that are thinking about futures and kind of designing for the future and thinking about this kind of thing, I imagine there's a lot of different ways that different companies kind of think about it, where I imagine sometimes it's more deeply embedded into the fabric of the company. I imagine some companies, it's kind of like a nice thing to have, or kind of this like icing on the work that they're doing. Or maybe it's kind of, I wouldn't quite say an afterthought, but it's maybe almost like a branding exercise. Like, what are the different ways that companies engage with people doing this kind of design work?
Yeah, I mean, all of what you mentioned and many, many more. And also worth saying, even different individuals within the same company view futures work differently. There's definitely this feeling of it being some sort of a luxury. A lot of organizations and a lot of groups within organizations and a lot of individuals within those groups within organizations think it's a bit of folly and want to sort of get results today, get to the end of the quarter, have a good fiscal year, whatever it is. And all of those things are important. I'm not denying them at all. I think the challenge that I've always had is trying to engage people with the idea that you have to have some idea of where you'd like to be or what you want to be when you grow up, or where the world might be going, or what opportunities you might be missing. And those things are sort of existential to a business, to a product, to an organization. You have to have an idea of that, or at least an idea of where you'd like to head or what your competition might be doing. And I think futures work has been sort of growing in maturity. I still think it's got a long way to go, which is one of the reasons I wrote this book. But I think it's graduating from the sort of whimsical sort of folly of the past, and it is turning into something a little bit more tactical, let's say, more important within a lot of organizations, although it is still largely viewed as a nice to have. And I've definitely been part of projects where you've you felt like actually this is just an away day for the senior leadership team, or to use up some budget at the end of the year for some creative session or whatever. And obviously that saddens me. I understand where it comes from, but it does sadden me, because I do think that there's this sort of growing feeling of us trying to understand the future, like, or trying to make sense of it, or trying to understand our place in it. But our ability to deliver on that desire is really low. And the quality of the work that we do in sort of the future space is quite poor. And I think my interest is in sort of trying to close that gap a little bit.
Yeah. And do you feel, and maybe it is changing as you kind of mentioned, but like, is there a decent fraction of your effort devoted to simply just kind of justifying this kind of work to the larger companies that you're a part of, and kind of explaining them how to balance this sort of short-term kind of quarterly thinking versus longer-term thinking? Yeah, is there still that justification effort that you still feel like needs to be done?
Think so. I wouldn't say I'm particularly good at it, and I don't tend to dedicate a great deal of my work to it, because it's sort of like trying to, sell something to somebody on their doorstep. If they don't want it, they don't want it.
Sure.
And you can do the work to try and encourage people. The biggest challenge, honestly, Sam, is the type of work that I do. It's really hard to pin an ROI on it, or a KPI or whatever metric, for lots of reasons. One is, a lot of the work that I do is about investigating areas where we shouldn't go or don't go. A lot of the work that I do is so far upstream that by the time a product reaches market and it is measurable, that work's sort of been forgotten, or it's not really got a real red thread all the way through that you can say, because of what Nick and his team did, we're now $6 billion in profit.
Right.
Like it's just really hard to justify. So unless there is a sort of cultural pull or an internal desire in people to do this work from a sort of belief they have within themselves, it's really hard to say, here are the strategic benefits of doing this work and it will make your company X% more profitable or whatever. It just doesn't exist. So I think all I can do is offer the pull as opposed to giving a push, and say, look, this work, a lot of people find it useful. Let's try and do some together. I do think one of the things that's really satisfying, obviously, particularly while I was at Google X, I got to work with a whole variety of different sorts of people. Other designers, of course, and engineers, but also PhD scientists and folks from sort of an MBA background, and investors and financiers and venture type people. And quite often, they either don't really know what design is or futures design is, or they don't want it. Or if they do know what it is, they sort of have a kind of hackneyed 80s version of what design might be.
Okay.
And it's like, give me a logo, do me a pitch deck, whatever it is. And you sort of do that, but then you start a journey with them. Okay. And I think that can be really rewarding, where you start to see the change in them. We're like, oh, okay, this is interesting, actually. This does help me with my goals. It's not just sort of a Kinko's transaction thing. It's like, we can start to build a culture in your way of thinking about what you're building, and design can actually help accelerate you and focus you and give you useful assets to communicate your vision to people, to get investors, or whatever it is that they care about. And I think that's a joyful moment for me, when people come on that journey with you and say, oh, actually, now I understand a bit more what it is you do.
That's amazing. And are there kinds of industries or kinds of companies, maybe the culture in the company, or even just the kinds of people within organizations that are kind of more either amenable and already bought into this idea, this kind of work already, or the ones who are more receptive to it once they actually experience it?
I don't think so. I couldn't necessarily pull out a typology of person. I think I like working with people that are comfortable with uncertainty. Okay. And open to learning, just generally, whether they're, like I say, whether they're a technical person or a business person, whatever it is. I like those sorts of people that are willing to come along for the ride and willing to give things a go. And I think they can come from anywhere, honestly. I wouldn't say there was a particular type of person. But yeah, I just like the act of the doing, as opposed to getting to that one particular hardcore answer and finding that turnkey solution or whatever it is. The actual act of curiosity and building a thing together and trying to build intellect and build rigor and depth in the future that they're exploring is where I get my joy.
Great. And actually related to typologies and taxonomies, I mean, in your book, you kind of have this taxonomy of different types of futures work. I don't know if you can lay that out a little bit and we kind of dive into each of them a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll do a 90,000 word book in a minute. No, I mean, essentially, just to be really clear, when I left Google X in 2023, I didn't set out to write a book I didn't want to become that sort of LinkedIn influencer with a method that I then sell to clients. It's absolutely not that. Just to be clear, it's not a how-to futures at all.
Well, and I would say not only is that, it's you're kind of showing the different futures aspects, like these kind of different types of work, and showing that they all have problems as well. It's not like, oh, you should do a little bit of these four. It's like, no, these are not necessarily the way to go. I think you're kind and fair to all of them, but you think all of them have a certain amount of problem or some sort of deficit.
Yeah, so essentially what the book is well, let me say what it's not again.
Sure.
It is not a manifesto. These are not my 10 mega trends or the world as I'd like to see it. It's not that. What it is saying I've spent 25 years talking to all sorts of people, from lay people to technical people to business people to any number of different folks about the future. And I think what happens is we jump straight at the what of the future. We talk about a prediction or a technology or an idea or a better state of the world or whatever it is. But what I'm trying to do is go one step below that and say, is there a sort of a bedrock of behavioral patterns into which we fall? And I think there is. And I think that we all feel comfortable in one of these four corners approaching conversations about the future. And I call them could, should, might, and don't. And I think what I do with the book is I go into the origins and history of those ways of thinking. I go into why they're useful and why they're attractive and how they manifest in our daily lives. But I think the important part is also to say where I think they're a little weak or they have these sort of blind spots that lots of people sort of conveniently ignore. And if I'm calling for anything with the book, it's to try and say, when I talk about more rigorous work about the future, what I would love to see is all four of those things being done all the time by by people, like sort of in the round. And I just don't think we do that. And I think that leads to this culture and this landscape of futures work, which is a little bit fragile, a little bit unfit for purpose, a little bit naive, definitely imbalanced, non-rigorous. And I think that represents a real weakness in our generation, and the next generation are going to want significantly more from us. So yeah, the book is basically trying to go one step below all of the ideas about the future and start to say, what are the underlying patterns first? And so that we can become a bit more aware of what we're doing when we're talking about the future.
Yeah, and I feel like that almost maps onto what you were saying of like the kinds of people who are more receptive to this are the ones who have a certain amount of uncertainty about the future, where to go. And there's almost this like intellectual humility. It seems as if that's kind of what you're calling for, is you don't have to be certain about where the future is going to be or saying this is the specific method to divine the possible futures. It's more about, let's take a number of different things together and use that as a way of slowly but surely kind of creating maybe a more holistic picture or set of pictures. Is that a fair way to describe that?
It is. And I think there are a bunch of people who, and in the book, I define this as sort of should futurism, which is who do have a sort of definitive position about where we should head. And it's either an ideological position that comes from sort of religions and folkloric tales and sort of destination futures, or it's a sort of what I call numeric fiction, which is this idea of observing patterns in the world and trying to project them forwards, and this sort of belief that you can algorithmically decode the world somehow and say, this is where this thing is going to be in 12 months' time. So there are those people who do have a very sort of definitive idea about a dot in the future that we should head towards, or where their particular industry or their particular tech is heading. And I think that, that comes with its benefits, but it's also got significant drawbacks. As anyone that's ever been to Vegas knows, there's no such thing as a fact in the future. The world is inherently volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous. And especially many of the things that we're now trying to map and model and, add an algorithm to, certainly anything that involves human behavior, is just naturally stochastic and unpredictable. So that's my sort of critique of should futurism. I guess what I'm saying with the book writ large is, no matter which of those four pots you feel the most comfortable in, there are three other territories that if you're truly honest about doing rigorous work about the future, you should spend some time in those. You should start thinking about what we could do and have some optimism and some positivity. You should also think what we might do, which is about plurality and lots of different scenarios and lots of different ideas about the future. But also you think about don't futurism, the areas where we don't want to go or don't want to end up, or things we want to steer ourselves or our users away from. So I'm just trying to offer this sort of, I would say, framework, a taxonomy for sort of awareness. Like when we're talking about the future, whether we're casually chatting with friends down the pub or giving a pitch deck presentation, that roundness, I just don't see it enough. And I think that leads to this sort of terrain of futures conversations that's a little bit, imbalanced, non-rigorous.
And how do you think, and when you're talking to clients or just people in general about thinking about the futures, how do you think about kind of balancing the idea of like thinking about where the future like might lead us, like potential different kinds of futures and kind of mapping out the possibilities, as well as kind of, you mentioned like the could thing, like actually saying, okay, or sorry, should, in terms of like where we might actually want to go. How do you think about balancing that as well, like the plurality of possibilities, alongside the fact that, especially if you're not a very large organization, if you're just kind of an individual person, like you don't have that much control over the direction of where we might be going. How do these, like this suite of approaches, how does that give you maybe a sense of agency or a sense of control, or just a better sense of kind of approaching futures?
Yeah, I think it's a thing that I'm very aware of is also my own privilege, that I've worked for, large trillions-dollar companies who have these sort of labs and these future-oriented teams that are well-funded and given the permission to do this type of work, and the space and the time and the resources. And I'm very much aware of that. And, I have friends that own small businesses that just don't have the space, the capacity, or maybe even the inclination or the time to discover the inclination to do this sort of work. And so it is a journey with everyone. I would say some form of idea about the future or some form of dedicated time, even if it's just 5 minutes at the end of the weekly meeting where everyone around the room says, what then? Or like, what does this all lead to? Or whatever, just a small little behavioral change can be useful. And I think, again, what I'm offering is sort of a gold standard, best in class version of what I would call a very rigorous way of talking about the future, which is to do all 4 of these ways of thinking all the time, with maximum effort and energy. Of course, if somebody is coming from a strong should futurist perspective, where maybe they are a sort of investor, or they're a sort of an MBA person who's looked at all the data and drawn the dotted lines, just sort of say to them, that dotted line is not data, it's a story. Like once it goes from solid to dotted, it ceases to be data. And so then you maybe introduce a bit more might to them and say, actually, there are maybe 2 or 3 other things, that a bit of uncertainty here, and maybe this competitor might do that, and let's build a scenario if that happens. And then bring in a bit more could, which is like, how can we encourage people to move towards a different version of the world, get people excited, think a bit more expansively. And then if they've really got time as well, like start thinking about don't and a bit more responsibility and things you want to draw away from, or have more responsibility for your impact on the world. So I think it's just gradually figuring out your audience or your partner and introducing more levels of rigor to their thinking about the future. I do appreciate that a lot of people don't have the, like I said, the time, the inclination, the budget, the resources to do all of this work. But I do think it's going to become increasingly important. In the press for this book, I've obviously spoken to a great deal of people from very different backgrounds. And it is clear to me that there is a huge sort of desire to talk about the future more, and a little bit of queasiness about where it all might be heading. And it's a very sort of blunt way to assess sentiment. But if you look at Google Trends, search terms like what will the future be like have tripled since 2020. So people are just, because of AI, because of global politics, because of the climate crisis, whatever it is, people feel like we should be talking about the future more. My argument is, I agree, and we're really not very good at it. And I think that gap is my problem, that I want us to try and not just produce better futures work, but as all of us are consumers of futures work all the time, from the TV, from our science fiction, from folks telling us statistics, people telling us stuff on our phones, we need to become more critical consumers of that work as well. And that will naturally mean that the people producing the futures work will have to get better. Their work will have to improve and increase. And I think that's the stronger argument, not point at practitioners and say, you need to get better. Point at the sort of recipients of their work and say, you can ask better questions and say, hang on, this is just a strident piece of don't futurism. What about all of the other things? Like, tell me more about the world that you would like to see, or the other options in place, or what you think we should do. That's the sort of the tension that I see, is that like desire versus delivery there's a huge gap between the two. I've done that gesture a lot on this, but you understand what I mean?
Yeah, no, totally. I almost feel like you're arguing that like thinking about the future, it's like some sort of intellectual muscle that we need to just actually exercise and train. And for most of us, we don't do that very much at all. And it's not to say, right, we need to be professional future bodybuilders, or now I'm kind of taking the analogy and stretching it to the breaking point, but we can still do a lot more than nothing and kind of incorporating some of these, sometimes piecemeal, but slowly but surely kind of getting better. And in terms of that kind of exercise or that sort of mental effort, is it some of it's related to also just like trying to think a little bit longer term of like, instead of thinking 1 year in the future, thinking 3 to 5 years in the future, then think more. Is there, because there's the 4 different mindsets of like trying to actually use these different kind of viewpoints to kind of expand yourself. And then is there also related to that, also trying to kind of expand your time horizon? Is that another feature that people should be exploring, or beyond a certain distance, it doesn't really make that much sense?
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I don't actually do in the book, and I try not to do in my daily life, is that the idea of the future is so contextually bound to what it is we're talking about. You know, if you're talking about the future of agriculture, for example, that might be a many years conversation. If you're talking about the future of AI, that might be a hours thing.
Right.
For example.
Right. Whatever we say now will not be relevant to it. Yeah.
And so I think you have to understand your sort of contextual awareness of what it is you're talking about, because often if you don't, the work can fall back into that sort of fantasy folly territory if you're thinking too far ahead or too far into the distance. A stronger way to think about it, a lot of the things that we live with are in sort of generations. So like things like hardware products, software releases, car launches, whatever it is. And I think thinking in terms of like second, third, fourth generation, or if you've got a law, what's the second, third, fourth version of that law? If you've got a model of something, what's the second, third, fourth of that? That's sort of a stronger way to think, because that naturally contextualizes the thing you're talking about. I think one of the challenges that I've had, without how long has it been before we got to AI? Not that long. One of the strange things that I've heard from people over the last year or so is that, and it goes back to, I think it's a William Gibson quote, where it's like, it's really hard to think about I'm butchering this, but it's really hard to think about the future because the present is too volatile. And he uses this lovely term, we have insufficient now to stand on, which I really love.
That's really great.
And a lot of people are saying, with AI, for example, machine intelligence, whatever we want to call it, things are changing so quickly that any ideas about the future are just sort of a waste of time. And I'm very clear that I'm not a person that makes predictions. And I think making predictions about AI is problematic. But my argument is, well, should we just not bother then? Like, should we just give up and just wait and see where it goes? Like, I don't think that's a strong strategy either, because we can still understand where we would maybe like to be, or the areas where we might like to avoid, or like try to plot out 10, 20, 30 directions it might go. Like, I still think those are valuable exercises. And they can change daily, and somebody could release a whole new model, or there could be a weighting scandal or whatever it is. Like, I get that. But my argument is, if things feel so fast and so volatile, to just say, well, we shouldn't do any futures work then, it's a sort of fundamental misunderstanding of the function of futures work. And I think it's because we've been told by our sort of, thirsty futurists on LinkedIn and on conference stages that being a futurist is about making predictions and being right. And I spot the mega trends and all this sort of stuff, which is just sort of cosplay futures work, in my opinion. And I think we all need to get much better at calling that stuff out and saying it's just not rigorous, it's not good enough, it's not useful. So I think everybody can do futures work and think about the future, no matter what it is that they're stood on, whether it's a very slow-moving industrial process or something that's changing weekly by like new software releases, for example. I think it's valid. It's vital even. And I definitely think our customers, whatever our customers means, the people using the things we're producing, they want that more from companies. They want to say, oh, where's this all heading? What does it all mean? What does it, what might it be like to live with this thing in 10 years' time?
I like that. And this also, that kind of accords well with like my own thought around thinking about the futures, is that certainly when things are so uncertain, right, making predictions is kind of a fool's errand. At the same time, though, not only is there a hunger for it in terms of understanding what the futures are, it means that in some ways there's a little bit more choice, which is it's less about like when things are so uncertain, you then have the opportunity to say, okay, what is the kind of world that I want to live in? And then say, okay, can we actually work our way backwards and try to chart that and figure out what will make certain futures more likely than others that actually accord well with our humanity or whatever it is, which I think some ways feels very, very heartening and inspiring, as opposed to saying, oh, we can't predict anything, therefore let's just let the future wash over us, which
exactly
feels like a real abdication of responsibility.
Yeah, just sort of stumbling into the future and letting it wash over us. And like I said, without wanting to get too like strident, I don't think the following, we all currently live in a time capsule that was accidentally planted by our predecessors, who also weren't very good at thinking about the future or weren't inclined to even do it. And we're mopping up all of the mistakes and errors and misjudgments and short-sightedness that they brought about in the world. And I think the following generation will do the same to us if we don't start doing it, particularly with some of the things that we're dealing with, which are, without wanting to get, again, too over the top, some of them are quite existential and quite big questions. And so if I was to say one thing that would be really lovely to see, it would be to see a big leader in something like, let's just say AI, just because it's the topic of the moment, a leader in that industry standing on stage and sort of walking through could, should, might, and don't, and saying, these are all the things we could do. This is why my company and the people who work for our company are excited. These are all the things we could bring about. These are the things that we should do. We should do these things because it'll be good for our shareholders, or it'll grow our business, or we'll, beat the competition. And this is what the market looks like. And we've got an opportunity here. Then also just bringing in a bit of uncertainty and talking about might and saying, well, this might also happen. And if that happens, we might do this. And if this happens, we might do that. And these things might come up and we don't necessarily know the answers to them. But then also talking about don't and saying, these are the threats and these are the areas we want to steer away from or be careful around. And this is how we're going to take responsibility for the things we're going to bring around in the world. There are a few leaders who do bits of that at separate meetings, depending on who they're talking to. But it's rare that you see somebody standing up and having that level of sort of depth and honesty about what it is that they're building. And it is, AI, for example, but like insert product or technology or idea here. And I think that I would love to see more of that, because I honestly feel like audiences and receivers of that kind of future storytelling are demanding it. They want more of that roundness and that depth of thinking and that uncertainty and that confidence and that, like, they need all of that for them to believe in something. And I just think it's a missed opportunity for the leaders of these organizations to just step up and say, in all humility, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And this is what we want to be.
And do you think the reason we don't see that yet is because these different streams of futures work are kind of separate and they kind of have everyone kind of defending their own territory? Or is it also just to actually have a certain amount of intellectual humility is not necessarily what sometimes they think like their board would want to hear, other kind of, and so is it a mixture of both, or is it a territorial kind of thing? How do you think about why we haven't seen that as much?
There's definitely a departmental segregation of these ways of thinking. And so let's just take something like don't futurism. That's typically within what I call the policing parts of organizations, the ethics, the corporate social responsibility teams. And then you've got the sort of should futurists, which are all the sort of people that do the analysts and the people that look at the markets and try to plot that line and say, we should go here because this is the biggest market opportunity. And, they definitely fall into domains and territories. I just also think, and this is a slightly larger observation that I'm maybe not well versed in, but the kind of depth and detail and nuance that I'm talking about is really hard to fit in a slogan or on the front of a political podium. Like, it's really hard to sort of have a nuanced conversation and a debate about something in the media landscape, in the investing landscape, in the sort of communications landscape that we live in. And I think that is a fundamental problem. One of the reasons I've done, I say, quite a bit of press for this book, one of the reasons I like podcasts is you can have a 40, 30-minute conversation and a bit of back and forth. I've also done 3-minute interviews on radio, which is just sort of, I mean, the conversation is glib at best.
Right. Yeah.
I understand that they're different mediums, but I would love to find a way where we can have these more in-depth conversations in the round with people, getting involved and have a bit more back and forth. But essentially, I think everything is sort of feels a bit Shark Tanky, where it's like, here are my five bullet points, I'm going to hit them and that's all I'm going to say. And it's all positive.
Right.
And everything's a problem and here is the solution. And I just think that my gut is that people are becoming a bit tired and a bit wary and a bit skeptical of that simplicity of messaging, particularly around complicated things like climate, like politics, like AI, like tech in general. So yeah, I'd love to find a way where we can have this more detailed conversation. And I think I'm not the only one who is calling for that.
It's heartening to hear that we should have that, and also that there are other people thinking about that kind of thing.
It also opens people up I think there's this sort of toxic positivity and sort of confidence in our world that has gotten a lot of people a long way. And I think we need a reckoning with that. And actually to say, I look back at some of the things, I'm nearly 50 now, but I look back on some of the things that I said with great confidence, maybe not even that long ago. I'm like, oh, I was wrong. And being okay with being wrong, or like, my views have changed or my opinions have changed. I'd love to see more of that, particularly around things like you said with the AI, where the bedrock is changing so quickly. We don't know anything. Like anyone that's making predictions or stating things with certainty, you should just approach that with real skepticism, because we don't have a culture where people can say, I was a bit wrong there. Yeah, maybe you're right. I should have thought about that slightly differently. Or
we certainly as a society incentivize, right, like doubling down, but as well as kind of the extremes of either positivity or negativity, like and these kind of extremes versus saying, oh, the world is messy. I made some mistakes. Like I thought it was going to be this way. I remember around the time I published my first book was like back in 2012. I was very excited that it was published around that time, because I was certain that was going to be around the last time that print books were going to be published. It was going to be ebooks from there on out. And of course, I was wildly wrong.
Sure.
And just seeing that kind of thing, just like that and like other kinds of like predictions I've held in my mind, whether it's, certain things around like autonomous vehicles or mobility, like just, right, we need to constantly be willing to say, these were not right. Like things were just kind of different. And you do not get points for those kinds of things. But I'd like to think that at least some part of our society actually wants that.
Yeah, and there are definitely professional practicing futurists who land $1 million contracts with major companies whose whole stock in trade is sort of selling predictions. And they have a sort of, my predictions are 98.3% correct. And you just like, what is this? And I'm much, much more comfortable with what I call reckons. They're kind of shruggy reckons, like, it seems like that could be a thing. But having 5 or 6 of them at any one time, this might happen, this might happen, this might happen, this might happen. Oh, if that happens, that would be interesting. That's not what people want. People want a slogan saying, Nick Foster says the market size will be 28% bigger by 2027 or whatever. Like, it's just such a level of foolish certainty about the world that I find really problematic. And we see it all the time. And even when people make predictions that are wrong and wrong and wrong and wrong, we give them another $1 million and say, come and do it for our company or whatever it is. It sounds quite bitter the way I say it, but I hope you understand it's more just, again, like as audiences, let's push back on this future stuff that we're told and sold and say, it's not good enough. It's not rigorous. Tell me more. What do you mean? Like, give me more detail. If we're going to be doing that by 2028, what does 2026 look like? Tell me the stages to get, like, just don't tolerate bad futures work.
And speaking of mistakes, like you mentioned earlier, that we're kind of we're living in a landscape full of like mistakes that previous futurists and designers have kind of made in terms of like thinking about the future. Like, can you expand on that a little bit? Kind of like flesh out what that means and how you think about that?
Yeah, not just designers, just to be clear.
Yeah, sure. Sorry, futurists and predictions. Yeah,
yeah, everything. Politicians, engineers, whatever. A classic example is I was born and raised in Derby, like I said, which is a sort of middling, damp, industrial city in the UK. It was the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, actually. It's where the first mechanized factories were built. And it grew and grew and grew, and it became the center of the British railway industry. And it's sort of like, I guess, a UK equivalent of something like Detroit, right? Just to give American listeners a parallel. And of course, as the world moved away from steam and away from coal and away from heavy engineering, and a lot of it got offshored, and Margaret Thatcher privatized a bunch of stuff, the city just sort of lost its way and lost its investment. And you go back there now and it's just a lot of tumbling down red brick buildings. You know, I'm still very fond of Derby, and it's got, it's trying to rebuild itself and gentrify and do all the things that these cities do. But I think that represents this idea of times are good right now. Let's just do more of that. And actually starting to think, well, hang on a second, these technologies, whatever it is, steam, railway, whatever, they might go away. They might decline. They might change. Customers might move to something else. People might move away. Whatever it is, the world is a changing system. And I think that lack of foresight or like a lack of willingness to spend time thinking about what might these buildings be good for when they're no longer building trains or whatever else, just a little bit of time and thought and energy. And it feels like, well, why would they? They were making good money at the time and everything was great and they couldn't possibly have foreseen the end of it. I disagree. Of course they could. Of course they could. Like, I can see the end of any number of amazing trillions-dollar companies right now, like we've all seen. I used to work for Nokia, like a titan of a growing industry that everybody was dedicated towards, buying and building cell phones. And Nokia was the king. Took about 5-6 years before it's just completely tailed off. So I do think we've got this near-termism and an obsession with sort of near-term success that stops us looking over the horizon or prevents us from doing it or doesn't encourage rigorous debate about how all this might come to an end. And another classic example is the move in New York City, for example, from horses to vehicles. Horses had huge problems, most notably waste, horse waste, a lot of it. And also corpses of horses used to litter the streets of New York. And then, then the car came along and everyone went, oh, hang on, this is amazing. We can have this. Obviously, fast forward 100 years or so, it takes over an hour to drive the length of Central Park. It's nuts. And there's respiratory diseases, pollution, more people are dying from car injuries, all this kind of stuff. And so we don't have a habit of thinking through things in multiple steps over multiple generations. I could go on. There are lots and lots of those sorts of examples where a lack of foresight or a lack of willingness to engage in futures conversations means that the next generation just have to mop up constantly the stuff that previous generations set in motion.
Yeah, no, and this reminds me in a couple of things, kind of a smaller scale, but you were mentioning with Nokia, there's a I guess a fictional, like a dramatized version of kind of like the rise and fall of the BlackBerry. There's a movie that came out, I guess, in the past few years. And I was watching it with my wife, and they kind of like showed the different years. And when it gets to 2007, I remember my wife going, "Oh no," because like she knows the iPhone is coming, but they have no idea. Like they can't. Right? It's like one of these things where like they were unwilling maybe to imagine that kind of thing, and they went from huge market share.
Yeah, and again, could they have imagined it? I don't know.
Potentially though, but it sounds like like maybe they weren't even trying, and that's a problem.
And the same with Blockbuster, the same with Kodak. Like either they didn't see something coming, or if they did see something coming, they put it way out into the impossible or way off into the distance. And so they were sort of sideswiped. And I think that or maybe they were just like, that's fine, and it'll be our time and we'll sunset the business. I don't think they thought like that. Like, that can also be a response, which is like our time has passed. And knowing that actually, I think is smart business sometimes.
It's really interesting. Right. 'Cause not every business needs to last forever, right? It can be a moment in time,
knowing that you're this business and it's going to have an end, that's actually quite mature. I think that's smart. It doesn't have to just keep bumping upwards always.
Although I imagine many of those businesses that end up in that situation, they might tell themselves that story after the fact rather than from the outset.
But if you're in the business of converting Super 8 video to digital video, your industry has got a sort of end zone. There is an end, like unless you completely reinvent what you do, there is a time to your business. Sometimes being aware of that is quite smart, I think.
Going back to prediction and kind of your dissatisfaction, I think, with like very concrete predictions versus kind of helping people kind of expand the space of what is possible. And there's right now the space of like quantitative forecasting of like these like prediction markets and forecasting is certainly having a moment. Like there's a lot of work happening in this space. Do you kind of have no patience for it? Think of it as complementary to some of this kind of work, something else entirely? Like how do you put that whole forecasting space within kind of the world of futures, if at all?
The challenge with the might futurism, when I talk about, so that's the sort of pluralistic, lots and lots and lots of different scenarios. The challenge with that is the number of scenarios is actually infinite, and it doesn't really help you make a decision. It just prepares you for what ifs, right? So I understand why people want to try and throw things like algorithmic assessments and sort of numeracy at markets and prediction engines and things like that. I understand because it helps you make a decision and it feels reassuring. And sometimes, we're getting better at that. Like I'm not here to mock what I call should futurism at all. I think it has strengths, and we're very talented at spotting patterns in the world. Look at the weather prediction engines we have now. Yeah, they're pretty good, but they can't really go more than 10, 12, 14 days before it gets a bit, I don't know.
Right.
Even though that's actually, I wouldn't say it's a closed system, but the number of variables is, let me be careful. The number of variables is large, but it is sort of a known-ish system. If we're trying to understand anything, like I said, any system that has human behavior within it, buying, selling, sentiment, whatever, any amount of sort of algorithmic insight and assessment and data ingestion Kendall Jenner could just tweet something about your brand tomorrow, completely out of the blue, and knock billions of dollars off the value of your company. There's no sort of algorithm that can incorporate that level of natural volatility. So I believe in this notion of observing data as it emerges and starting to build patterns of understanding and correlations and building ideas of how a system works, and then using that to project lines into the future and say, well, hang on, this looks like it's going to be 3 times the size in 5 years. Sort of as good as we've got. But the problem I've got is people then get really strident and certain, and they sort of rubber stamp it and draw a red ring around that dot on a chart. And like I said, once the line goes from solid to dotted, it ceases to be data. It's a story. And so I call it numeric fiction as a way of kind of needling some of my more analytical colleagues to say, it's a story. It's a story. Like, I have reason to believe in that story, but I'm a designer. I don't tend to use those tools. I observe human behaviors and the way that people live with, in my case, technology. And I have hunches and reckons too that are also stories, but they're built off a different sort of sampling style, let's say. So yeah, all are welcome, but let's try and do all together and try and figure out a direction. And I think the challenge with should futurism is it does feel, because numbers just have a solidity to them that words don't. People attribute a level of sort of clarity and accuracy to those predictions that they wouldn't from somebody just saying, I reckon this might be big.
Got it. Okay. So like they have value, but they should be held more lightly than they often are.
I would say, yeah, you could have answered that question in a minute instead of my 3.
No, this is good.
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so related to stories, and you mentioned a whole bunch, I guess not too much, but you definitely in your book discuss the realm of science fiction to a certain degree, especially in the context of that we kind of fall into like certain like science fictional attractors where it becomes very easy to, rather than thinking about like, the true broad space of like what the future might look like and lots of different science fictional stories, we think about Star Trek or a couple other like very well-known things, and you kind of view that as like that's a sort of a narrowing of the possibility space. And how would you maybe kind of think about the way in which science fiction should be used in the realm of futures work?
Yeah. Again, this is a really long conversation and you and I should go out for dinner. But when people meet me and they understand what I do, which is sort of think about the future of technology, let's say, they assume that I'm a huge fan of science fiction. And actually, nothing could be further from the truth. I'm not a huge fan. I don't read it. I don't watch a lot of it. I certainly don't use it as an indicator for my work, but that does put me in a minority. The part where I start to offend big science fiction acolytes is when I sort of try and make the provocative point that the primary function of science fiction, particularly science fiction cinema, we should have a difference there, is to entertain. It's an entertainment medium with a beginning, middle, and end, and a story and an arc and a hero and a villain and whatever else. Alongside that is usually a conversation about technology or devices or a social structure, let's say, that's changed. And some of those things can be quite useful, and they can be kind of consequence-free spaces to explore possibility or dystopias even, and things that we don't want to head towards. So there can be useful structures to it. In my experience of working in this world for 25 years, people use science fiction in a very ham-fisted way. They'll sort of just grab at these what Hitchcock called MacGuffins, these kind of totems or ideas or devices or bits of language even, and just sort of want to make them so somehow. And what I think that actually represents is a massive sort of shortcutting of the real function of what science fiction is, but also just a negligence. People aren't doing the real thinking themselves. If they're presented with the technology and they're like, oh, it's like that thing on Star Trek, let's just make that. Or let's call this project whatever, Replicant or something. And it just stops actual rigorous conversations about the future. Because the things that exist in science fiction cinema in particular, the devices, the objects, whatever it is, they're just there to help keep the story moving forwards. They're not rigorously considered propositions for how we should do things in the real world. The hero or the villain or the co-star or whatever needs a thing to point at someone to go diddly doop, and the thing moves on to the next scene. That's why those things exist. But like I said, I've been around a lot of different people, and you can see this in the names of the projects that come out of places like Silicon Valley. Cortana is from Halo, for example, and the Falcon rockets are the Millennium Falcon. All of the meeting rooms at Google X were named after science fiction robots, for example. And it sets the tone for what companies think is important, and Project Stargate, the AI project, it just goes on and on and on. The list is endless of where these sorts of shortcuts to actual thinking, they become these kind of placeholders, and everyone goes, oh, I get it. And the canonical example is the swipey gestural interface from Minority Report, which is super compelling on screen. And it's a lot more exciting than watching somebody scroll through an SD card, for example.
Right.
And millions, if not billions of dollars have been spent, and lots of person hours have been spent trying to make that real. And actually, if you do read up on the production of that movie, Tom Cruise had to take regular breaks because holding your arms out.
Right, it's exhausting.
It's exhausting. Interrogators use it as a stress position, actually. So it doesn't make a lot of sense, but it doesn't stop people because it's so compelling on screen. You're like, wow, it would be lovely. And you go, okay, so talk me through how you're going to book a holiday for a family of 4 to Madrid next year by doing this, It suddenly just breaks down and doesn't start to make sense to people.
Right.
So anyway.
Yeah, even just in the movies where, every interface is making beeping and loud and lots of noises, and it looks great for a small scene,
Sure.
but you would go out of your mind if that was the interface that was making all these noises all the time. And and it's also, I definitely resonate with what you're talking about. And full disclosure, I am a big science fiction fan, but at the same time though, I view it, it's not about like the whiz-bang gadgets. And even within the outside of cinema, like the science fiction stories and novels and things, it's much more, I would say, it's much more about like ideas, either about ideas about our current moment and then kind of using a fictional setting as a vehicle for telling these things, or it's a series of thought experiments. And it's not really about predicting the future. And there's lots of science fiction stories that have never come true. We often fixate on the ones that have come true at saying, oh, these things are really good at predicting, even though we kind of just ignore all the ones that are wildly off the mark. And and I agree that kind of using various things that we see, especially gadgets, as kind of this a way of like shortcutting our actual interrogation of like what we want the world to look like. It narrows all these kinds of things. Yeah. Right. As opposed to saying, these are thought experiments. They should be expanding how we think about this kind of stuff, as opposed to, narrowing the scope of the possible.
And there are people, and it sounds like you're one of them, who are deep in science fiction and science fiction lore. And I have friends who are too, who understand that difference. I would say you're in a minority, given the people I worked with.
Interesting.
I would say that it's sort of a crisis of imagination that they fill with science fiction.
Interesting. Okay.
Actually, it's, I'm friends with Bruce Sterling. I know quite a few science fiction writers. And if you talk to them, they're not in the business of making predictions or trying to define what should be made. They're trying to tell interesting stories or provoke a user to think, provoke a reader to think differently about the way the world works, or, those are the kinds of things they're interested in. And any foresight is just sort of strictly coincidental, really. Right. It's just like, if it happens, it happens. If it doesn't, it doesn't. But that's not what I'm trying to do. But yes, I think I was working on a project with the British Army a long, long time ago, which was called the Future Infantry Soldier Technology Project, which is FIST.
God.
Not my name, their name. But the same thing, these people had tens of millions of pounds worth of budget. And the fella just came in the room and said, all in his brigadier's outfit or whatever. We talked for 10 minutes or so, and he just said, actually, I just want my soldiers to feel like RoboCop. I was like, there's so much to unpack there. Like, I just don't know even where to start. It's a dystopian movie for starters. And
it's not a future you want.
No. And anyway, it's just that sort of, and I sort of get what he was meaning. Like, I want the soldiers to feel confident and indestructible and strong. But it's just, do some real thinking yourself. Don't just pull that icon and say, that, can you make that for us? Which, if we had have done, I think he would have been dissatisfied anyway. So yeah, there's a lot of that goes on, that sort of plug and play, very ham-fisted plug and play from science fiction, particularly science fiction cinema, let's be honest, into product development, the naming of projects, the framing, the language, the sort of tropes and ideas and the structures that come from real technology development. I just think it represents a real problem.
Yeah, no, that's, and I agree that I think, right, like sci-fi cinema in particular, right, like that is kind of, right, that's not where there's necessarily like the deepest ideas and like thought experiments. It's much more just, right, there's a lot of really, really cool things to move the story forward, and right, to hang your understanding of the future based on just a bunch of cool stuff is not, does not make a rich and well thought out future.
Yeah.
And so related to that, maybe one place to end would be, you talk about at the end of the book, kind of your approach. And we've talked already about kind of combining these 4 different approaches, but at the end, you also discussed this, like the future mundane, kind of like the lived in future where, and because the truth is any sort of future is not going to feel futuristic when it's happening to you. It's going to just be stuff. I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about that vision, which I found incredibly compelling.
Oh, that's very kind. Yeah, it's sort of it's the arc of my career, I would say, a little bit. That there was a moment of reckoning midway through my career where I realized I'd been producing a lot of this sort of could futurism, where, this bombastic, excitable, futuristic stuff, because I thought that's what you were supposed to do. And then I would go home at the weekends to meet my mum and dad, go to the pub, have dinner at the pub, and just be like, it doesn't associate with the drawings I've been doing all week at all. And I just started to feel that dissonance between the two. So I wrote an essay in 2013 called The Future Mundane, which is about that, like you said, once the future arrives, it's very quickly normalized and integrated into all of the stuff that we do every day. Like I have this thing here that's a supercomputer by any stretch of the imagination. The classic thing is bigger than all of the compute power of the Apollo missions combined. But I also have some jewelry there and an old pot that I inherited, and some, I've got to go to 7-Eleven in a minute and pick up some, it's just ordinary and normalized. And I found that having that mindset about the future and starting to talk about big shifts and big modifications to our lives and big technologies in a grounded, ordinary, everyday lived-in experience suddenly made everyone go, oh, hang on, this will happen to us. Okay, I get it now. And the conversation just suddenly grounded in a way that I hadn't seen before. It stopped being heroic. It stopped the future being another place happening to other people. So when people are talking about whatever it is, VR or whatever, fine, let's assume that VR is super successful, affordable, mass adopted. Right, let's talk through a holiday with a family of 4 going up Big Sur or something. Let's talk that through and talk about little Jimmy needs to go to the bathroom. What happens? And just really getting into the grains of the everyday lived experience. I think one of the misreadings that people have had with the future mundane is that I say that they think I'm saying that the future will be sort of boring and ordinary. And people say, well, the present is terrifying and awful. What I'm saying is, yes, change happens all the time. And there's a lot of it about right now. Some of it ideologically good for people, some of it ideologically bad for people. I think what I'm trying to say is actually grounding change, not just pointing at the change and saying that's a change, we should talk about that, just trying to contextualize it a bit more and understand that there will be persistences and things will continue on through that change and exist through that. And humans are sort of very adaptable, malleable creatures, and we find our way around new technologies quite quickly. Anyone that's taken a Waymo in San Francisco, for example, first couple of trips, it's and very quickly it sort of just normalizes and it becomes, what time am I going to get to lunch? And, that sort of, it just does. We're very good at that. And so I like to talk about emerging technologies, particularly as a ordinary, everyday, lived in, normalized part of society. And like I said, when you do that, all of the coulds and the shoulds and the mights and the don'ts, they become real rather than abstract.
Oh, I love this. And actually, it reminds me of the story that I like telling of. So my grandfather, he lived to the age of 99 and read science fiction since the modern dawn of the genre. He was a dentist, but he just read a lot of science fiction. And I remember when the iPhone first came out, I went with him and my father to the Apple store. And we're playing with the iPhone. And he's like, this is it. This is the object from the future that I've been reading about. And we've gone, speaking to adaptability, we've gone from that moment to complaining about camera resolution and battery life. And it still is an object from the future, but it's also very integrated into every other aspect of our experience. And seeing there's issues around wonder and gratitude and taking and thinking about the future, but even separate from that, recognizing how adaptable we are to these things means that when we continue to think about the future, we have to integrate that adaptability into every aspect of those kinds of things. So it's really good.
I think that's another part of one of the issues I have with science fiction as well, is obviously within any storytelling, you have a major character and they're typically a hero. And when we talk about the future through the eyes of sort of a science fiction mindset, we often see these kind of visions of the future that are heroic. So when people are talking about, let's say, VR, it's always a brain surgeon or a rocket scientist or a city architect doing something. You actually look at VR statistics, it's about 70% playing games and the rest is YouTube. That's basically what people do. If you actually look at how people use this amazing supercomputer, they're using it to, play games on the toilet. They're trying to go through their ex-girlfriend's Instagram, whatever it is, like ordinary things that people actually do. I would love to see visions of the future and future technologies and these amazing new things we're talking about today. I'd love to see those stories told of like, actually, this is the shape of the world, and that sort of gritty, grounded way. Incidentally, there is a branch of science fiction called mundane science fiction, which is again where they don't tolerate any absurdities. I can't quite remember what this group calls that kind of fantasy technology. It's very sort of hard science fiction, but grounded in ordinary everyday stories about making breakfast or whatever else. I find those things much more compelling than any kind of maglev monorail to the middle of a city kind of, they feel like lived in places.
Right. No, well, I love this. Yeah, I love this charge to really understand the future. You need to make it almost like, as boring and ordinary as possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That might be a great place to end. Thank you so much. This is a fantastic conversation.
I've really enjoyed it. It's been nice to be here. Yeah.
Thank you.